The mic crackles with a recorded filing number, and the room realizes the divorce was planned. I stand just off the stage, edge where the carpet changes texture, present tense, clinging to my breath as the wireless mic hums against the glass podium, and everyone recalibrates at once, heads turning, shoulders stiffening the quiet, tightening like a cord pulled too fast. Bright lights flatten faces and make the air feel thinner, and I can see the stage manager glance at security without moving her feet, a choreography learned long before tonight, while the mic remains alive, an object with authority dictating who is permitted to sound and who must swallow words. The hum fades, returns, fades again, as if the device itself is testing the room's compliance, and I feel the control shift in inches rather than yards, subtle enough that nobody names it obvious, enough that nobody questions it. A hand reaches for the mic stand, not mine, and the sound dies, leaving the echo of that filing number suspended, where applause usually lives a number without context that still lands like a verdict because it arrives through a system designed to be believed. The audience doesn't know me, not really, but they know procedure, and procedure has just claimed the space. Conversations abort mid-syllable, a laugh dissolves into a cough, phones pause halfway out of pockets, and the exit doors at the back of the ballroom settle into their frames with a soft, synchronized click that sounds accidental until it doesn't. I am present, planted, watching the room accept new rules without protest, and the wireless mic rests against the podium like a small baton passed between hands that will never be offered to me. A coordinator murmurs something into an earpiece and receives a nod without eye contact, and the nod travels outward as posture, as distance as a newly measured radius around me that no one crosses, not out of cruelty, but out of instruction. Because public spaces train bodies to obey signals faster than hearts can object. I feel the urge to step forward and do what I have always done. Smooth edges, clarify intent, frame a message so it lands gently, but the floor between me and the podium has been claimed by lighting and tape marks that define safe movement, and my shoes stop at the seam where planning becomes performance. The present refuses to become memory. It insists on detail, on the way the mic cable coils with obedient slack, on the faint hiss of amplification, waiting for permission on the fact that my hands are empty, while the object that decides truth sits inches from a mouth that is not mine. I watch faces register the idea of a filing before the meaning arrives, because the sound came first, and sound in this room outranks explanation, outranks fairness, outranks the person standing alone at the margin. The program on the chairbacks promises celebration and partnership in tasteful fonts, and the contradiction hums louder than the mic ever did. A moral mismatch nobody names because naming would require speaking, and speaking requires access. The filing number doesn't accuse me. It appoints the room as judge and makes silence enforceable. Someone clears their throat on stage, and the glass podium catches the light, reflecting a fractured version of the ceiling that makes the space look taller than it is, more official, more final. I am aware of the time without knowing the hour of how the next minutes will be managed by cues and cues alone, and I feel the consequence in my chest as a narrowing rather than a blow, a sense that whatever I say later will sound like an interruption instead of a truth. The wireless mic is lifted, tested once more with a soft tap that produces a polite thud, and the audience accepts the authority of the sound again, because repetition breeds trust faster than reason, and trust breeds compliance faster than place. Courage. I think of how easily rooms like this decide outcomes without malice, how the choreography of order can make a personal rupture feel administrative, and how administration hides behind neutrality while doing its clean, decisive work. A smile flashes from the stage, practiced and reassuring, and I recognize it as a signal to proceed, not to me but to everyone else, and the room exhales together as if relieved that confusion has been given a frame. The exit doors remain closed, the aisle remains clear, and the space around me remains conspicuously untouched, a perimeter created by shared understanding rather than force, and I realize that presence alone does not grant participation, not when the object that carries truth has already chosen its bearer. The hum returns briefly, then stops, and the quiet that follows is heavier because it has been curated, because it belongs to someone who knows how to hold it. When the mic goes dead again, the doors stay shut, and my silence becomes the signal that matters next. I'm Emily Carter, 38, a former marketing strategist from Austin, Texas. I remember the months before tonight as a careful, narrowing past tense because the present hadn't learned how to hold us yet, when I folded my days around his schedule and told myself this was partnership rather than erasure when the folded guest list lived on our kitchen counter, like a harmless prop and not the first boundary I would fail to cross. I quit my job in a clean meeting with rehearsed gratitude, carrying home a box that smelled faintly of copier heat and ambition, and I told friends it was temporary, strategic loving because those words made the decision feel mutual instead of directional. The guest list grew and shrank with the confidence of someone else's calendar names added in pencil, erased in pen, folded again along the same crease until the paper softened and obeyed, and I took pride in the quiet competence of it, in how permission could be organized without anyone noticing who granted it. The doorway to his new office stayed bright in my memory light pouring in while I hovered just outside with coffee cooling in my hand, the open frame, promising inclusion even as meetings started without me, and I learned to wait because waiting looked supportive and sounded patient. The doorway stayed bright while permission quietly shifted. I stopped correcting drafts that bore my fingerprints and watched my language soften into suggestions, watched my access to shared folders reroute through assistants whose names I learned too late, and I told myself this was the cost of focus, that proximity to success required sacrifice measured in hours and not in voice. The folded guest list traveled with me to site visits, tucked under my arm like a credential, and people smiled when they saw it, because paper confers authority even before it proves accuracy, and I felt useful again, necessary in a way that didn't threaten anyone. He thanked me in public with the practiced warmth of someone who understands optics, and in private he deferred decisions to later, to after the quarter, to when things stabilized, and I believed the delays were weather, not walls. I learned the rhythm of his days and adjusted mine accordingly. Meals timed to calls, errands, mapped around rehearsals, my former calendar dissolving into white space that looked like freedom until it sounded like absence. The guest list became a language between us, a shorthand for who mattered and when, and I edited it, carefully aware that names are leverage, even when they're only written in pencil, aware too that erasing can feel kinder than confronting. There were small signs I chose to call noise, the way my email stopped autofilling, certain addresses, the way questions returned, answered by someone else, the way my badge lived in a different pocket because it wasn't needed as often. And I told myself this was progress, this was trust. I mistook the quiet efficiency of support for shared control, and the room rewarded that mistake with speed. When friends asked how it felt to step back, I described relief, the luxury of focus, the romance of believing in someone else's climb, and I didn't mention the cold arithmetic of access, how each favor recalibrated who spoke first and who accepts it, waited. The folded guest list accumulated coffee rings and corner dents, evidence of use that made it feel earned, and I smoothed it flat before meetings because order felt like a virtue I could still claim. The doorway remained open, always open, and the light never dimmed, and I learned to stand just inside the threshold without crossing to listen for cues that never came to tell myself that proximity was participation. He stopped asking my opinion on messaging and started thanking me for logistics, and I accepted the downgrade because it arrived wrapped in appreciation, because gratitude can anesthetize loss if you let it. The guest list changed hands, more often passed to coordinators who nodded and returned it with notes in the margins, and I read those notes like scripture decoding priorities from font size and placement, telling myself that influence didn't require credit. I slept lightly, rehearsing contingencies I didn't yet have names for, and when I woke before dawn, the house felt like a waiting room, furniture arranged for conversations that would happen elsewhere. There were moments when the truth brushed past me, an assistant's pause, a calendar block. I couldn't open a meeting title that read neutral but felt final, and I chose patience because patience had always paid off before. The guest list folded again, the crease deepening, and I pressed it flat with my palm, as if pressure could restore symmetry, as if careful handling could prevent paper from tearing when pulled the wrong way. I told myself love could absorb imbalance, that contribution didn't need a microphone, that stepping back was a form of strength, and the story held as long as no one tested it in public. When the event date settled and the program went to print, my name appeared where it belonged, small but present, and I took that as confirmation rather than placeholder proof, rather than permission. The doorway glowed, the list obeyed, and the silence between decisions grew comfortable enough to feel like home, and I didn't see how easily comfort trains you to stop knocking. By the time the guest list stopped changing, the decision had already moved to a room I couldn't enter. I noticed the fracture on a Tuesday afternoon when logistics demanded precision and the venue keycard refused to pretend it didn't matter. Past tense steadies me here, because this was the moment order stopped being neutral and started behaving like a person with preferences, when I stood in the service corridor outside the ballroom offices and watched the green light blink. Once hesitate, then settle into a steady glow that wasn't meant for me. The air back there smelled like cleaning solution and printer toner, a working space where authority travels quietly, and I slipped the keycard into my pocket with the practiced calm of someone who had spent months smoothing problems before they surfaced. The clipboard lived on a metal shelf by the door pages clipped tight, and I told myself I was only checking timing windows, only confirming access for vendors, only doing the invisible work that kept the visible parts elegant. The access log opened with a familiar interface and an unfamiliar line, a late-night override marked with a generic location and a time of day that didn't fit the rehearsal schedule, the kind of discrepancy you feel before you understand, because systems don't invent exceptions without instruction. I stared at the line until it sharpened, noticing the masked badge suffix and the quiet confidence of the entry, and the consequence arrived immediately as a shift in my posture. Shoulders back, questions rerouted, the instinct to fix replaced by the need to preserve. The venue keycard felt heavier after that, not because plastic changes weight, but because permission does, and I closed the log without saving, knowing that the act of looking had already changed how I would move through the next hours. Someone laughed down the corridor, and the sound bounced cheerful and irrelevant, while I copied the reference code into my phone's notes, a habit from my old life, where documentation was protection and silence was strategy. The doorway to the operations office stood half-lit light, spilling out as staff moved in and out with purpose, and I hovered at the threshold long enough to be seen without being invited, a familiar stance that suddenly felt less voluntary. The override time sat wrong in my head, late enough to be deliberate, early enough to be quiet, and I ran the rehearsal timeline again, watching how that single line created a new path through the week, one that didn't include me asking questions out loud. The access log didn't accuse anyone. It quietly removed my option to be naive. I adjusted my plan, rerouted deliveries, and told the coordinator we'd confirm final cues after another check. My voice steady because steadiness buys time, and time buys clarity when you know where to look. The keycard flashed again at a different door and opened without protest, a reminder that access isn't binary so much as curated, and I began to understand that the room had been divided long before anyone noticed the tape marks on the visit floor. I printed the log page on a shared printer and collected it before the tray cooled, folding it once, twice, until it fit inside a notebook that used to hold campaign briefs, the paper warm enough to feel alive. The choice to keep it felt procedural rather than emotional, a necessary step in maintaining options, and the consequence followed in the way conversations shifted around me, people answering questions I hadn't asked yet, people smiling with the relief of someone who believes coordination is handled. I didn't confront him that night because confrontation would have flattened the timeline, and the timeline was the only thing still telling the truth. At home, the keycard lived on the counter beside the folded guest list, two objects pretending not to know each other, and I set them parallel because alignment has always calmed me, even when the alignment is temporary. I replayed the access time in my head, matching it to calendar blocks that had gone gray to dinners, canceled with apologies that sounded rehearsed, and the pattern tightened without effort, a logic that didn't require belief to function. The next morning, I moved through planning calls with an efficiency that surprised me, asking fewer questions, recording more answers, and when someone mentioned a late adjustment approved overnight, I nodded as if it were weather, as if nothing about it altered who was allowed to decide. The doorway stayed bright, the office hummed, and the system continued to reward obedience with smoothness, while my silence did a different kind of work, gathering weight. By the time I slipped the log into my bag, the venue had already chosen sides without raising its voice. The rehearsal took place in the ballroom, with the lights turned up to an unforgiving brightness, past tense, settling in because this was when private arrangements learned how to perform, when rows of chairs stood in obedient symmetry and voices carried farther than intended. I arrived early with the projector remote warm from my palm, an object that pretended to be neutral while deciding what the room would see, and I stood near the tech table as staff tested cues and vendors drifted in with coffee cups and practiced patience. The space filled gradually, a low tide of conversation rising to a hum, and I watched how bodies chose seats according to status without instruction, how authority announces itself before anyone names it. The projector flickered to life for a sound check, throwing a pale rectangle onto the screen, and the remote clicked softly as a coordinator scrolled through slides, my hand steady because steadiness reads as competence even when it hides. Calculation. Someone asked for a quick run-through of mic levels, and the wireless mic chirped the sound crisp enough to make heads turn, crisp enough to command attention without effort. A camera icon flashed briefly on the control monitor, an automated confirmation that recording was live for archival purposes, and I felt the room tighten as people remembered they were visible. The rehearsal moved forward in pieces, applause, cues marked walk-on timing measured in steps, and I stood where I always did just outside the brightest light, adjusting notes as if logistics were the only story unfolding. Then the projector hesitated, the screen went black for a beat, and when it returned, it showed not a slide, but a live feed from the ballroom entrance, a wide-angle view with a generic location tag in the corner and a time of day stamp that sat uncomfortably close to the present. A technician apologized and reached for the remote, but the mic picked up a low instruction at the same moment, a voice familiar enough to land before context, telling someone to proceed, to hold, to wait until the room was full. The sound traveled cleanly amplified by accident into intention, and conversations faltered as the audience processed the mismatch between rehearsal and command. The camera feed lingered just long enough to register faces, pausing mid-step, a coordinator freezing with a clipboard, half-raised security, glancing toward the doors, and then the screen went dark again, the error corrected with professional speed that only emphasized what had already been shared. The projector didn't fail. It briefly told the truth out loud and let the room hear it. Laughter rippled uncertain, then collapsed into silence as people avoided eye contact, the witness wave moving in 3 clean phases that no one planned: curiosity, recognition, retreat. I felt the immediate consequence in the way space opened around me, a subtle clearing as if proximity itself had become risky, and I shifted my stance because staying still would have read like defiance. Someone whispered that it was nothing, just a crossover channel, and the explanation satisfied those who needed one, because plausible deniability is a powerful sedative in public spaces. The projector remote cooled in my hand as the coordinator resumed the deck, and the rehearsal continued with an efficiency that felt aggressive. Applause cues sharpened transitions, smoothed the room, eager to reassert order. I watched the camera icon disappear from the monitor and made a note of the generic label, the time of day format, the way the mic had caught a phrase that wasn't meant for amplification details that mattered because they created a record without calling itself evidence. The door at the back of the ballroom closed, softly, not locked, just closed, and the sound carried farther than it should have, a punctuation mark that settled the matter of who belonged inside the next decisions. I caught a glimpse of the coordinator's face as she moved past me, the careful neutrality of someone trained to manage risk rather than truth, and I understood that the public nature of the moment had shifted the calculus without forcing a confrontation. The rehearsal wrapped early, people dispersing with polite smiles and phones, raised just enough to check messages without appearing to record, and the air felt cleaner for having absorbed the mistake and moved on. I stayed behind to help reset chairs, the remote back on the table, the projector cooling, and I felt the aftershock as a tightening in my chest that didn't ask for attention but demanded discipline. When the lights went down, the mistake remained, and I realized the room had learned my silence by watching the screen. The envelope arrived without ceremony, past tense, carrying me, because this was the moment procedure learned how to bruise, when a sealed legal envelope sat among courier boxes in the operations office, as if it belonged there, as if paper with a heavier purpose didn't change the air around it. I recognized the thickness before I recognized the restraint, the way the flap was pressed, with care rather than urgency, and I picked it up to move it out of traffic, telling myself logistics again, telling myself neutrality, while the dim plast adhesive seam resisted just enough to remind me that opening is an action with consequences. The coordinator glanced over and said it was probably for counsel, her tone light, and the consequence landed immediately as a tightening in my throat, because counsel had not been mentioned in any timeline I had been given. I set the envelope on the edge of the desk, angled so the return line faced me, and the name there was generic, professional, familiar, in the way institutions are familiar when they intend to be believed. The room hummed with printers and low voices, and I did what I have always done when certainty is dangerous. I looked for context rather than permission. On the shared monitor, an internal email thread refreshed as someone toggled Windows, the subject line, neutral enough to be invisible, the kind of language designed to move without attracting attention, and I caught a phrase that didn't belong. In rehearsal week, a coordination note about filings, and about it every 2-1. Timing windows, a request to confirm delivery before an announcement. The message header showed a short reference code and a department tag instead of names, the time of day, tucked neatly into the corner, and I felt the logic fracture as cleanly as glass under pressure, because the sequence now made sense in the wrong order. The envelope wasn't reactive, it was scheduled. The immediate consequence was behavioral. I stopped hovering and stopped asking, and started reading, copying the thread into a private folder with the efficiency of someone who knows delay is a luxury they no longer have. The email didn't explain anything, it simply proved that decisions had been synchronized without me. I slid the envelope into my bag, not to hide it, but to prevent it from being rerouted, and the act recalibrated my role from facilitator to archivist, from smoothing to preserving. The coordinator returned with coffee and apologized for the confusion earlier, her eyes careful, and I nodded because nodding keeps doors open while words can close them too early. I reviewed the thread again, noting the phrasing that avoided dates and amounts, the reliance on role titles instead of signatures, the way authority distributes itself when it wants to remain plausible, and I matched it to the access override. I had already seen the late-night entry that now read, like preparation rather than error. The sealed legal envelope pressed against my side as I stood, a physical reminder that paper has weight even before it is opened, and I adjusted my bag so it wouldn't bend, because preserving condition felt like preserving truth. In the hallway, I passed the bright doorway to the executive office and didn't slow the light unchanged the threshold, still welcoming in appearance, and I felt the secondary consequence arrive as resolve rather than fear, a quiet shift in how I measured risk. At home that night, the envelope lived on the kitchen table, beside the folded guest list and the venue keycard, 3 objects aligned without touching a still life of permission, preparation, and proof, and I resisted the urge to open it, because opening would collapse the timeline I needed intact. I checked the internal email once more, focusing on the phrases that implied certainty, the coordination language that assumes compliance, and I recognized my own habits, reflected back at me the careful framing, the avoidance of explicitness, the reliance on process to carry intent without exposure. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by rehearsed explanations I would not give, yet by imagined confrontations I would not initiate, and I woke early with the sense that waiting was no longer passive, but strategic, that time could be an ally, if treated as such. The next day at the venue, conversations adjusted around me, small deferences offered and withdrawn, and I noticed how the sealed envelope changed my posture, even unseen, how knowledge alone alters presence. I asked for a copy of the rehearsal deck and received it without question. Asked for a confirmation call and got a slot, not because anyone suspected, but because momentum rewards confidence. I noted who was CC'd and who wasn't, the subtle cartography of power drawn in email fields, and I added nothing that could be traced back to emotion, only questions that required answers. The envelope stayed sealed, its edges crisp, and that restraint became my discipline, a way to maintain leverage without declaring it. By the time I set the envelope back in my bag, the story had broken cleanly in two, and I knew which half I was keeping. The incident log waited for me on a rolling cart near the service elevator, past tense steady, because this was when patience hardened into method, when the clipboard's metal clip caught the overhead light and announced itself as a tool, rather than a prop. I lifted it with permission already implied, by my presence pages thick with entries written to satisfy policy rather than curiosity, and I scanned for the day's routine notations, first the small truths that make larger ones legible by contrast. The hallway smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and coffee, a neutral corridor that absorbs secrets without complaint, and I leaned the clipboard against the wall to free one hand, the pen clicking softly as I traced lines down the column of times. There it was again, the anomaly that refused to behave, a filing reference noted as received during a window when nothing official should have been processed, a time of day stamp early enough to be deniable and late enough to be intentional, paired with a generic location tag that had been used before to smooth handoffs. The consequence arrived immediately as a shift in how I breathed slower counted, because the difference between rumor and record lives in margins, not conclusions. I copied the entry into my notes with the exact spacing preserved, a habit from campaigns where the shape of information mattered as much as its content, and I checked the adjacent lines to confirm pattern rather than exception. A staffer passed with a stack of programs and nodded, and I nodded back, the choreography intact, because nothing alerts a system faster than visible urgency. I turned the clipboard slightly to catch the light again, and noticed the pressure marks beneath the ink, the ghost of a prior entry, erased and replaced a mundane detail that still altered behavior because it suggested revision after the fact. The chain tightened, light remained, movement stopped. The motif landed without drama, a felt understanding that the doorway would stay open while my options narrowed, and I felt the logic click into place with a precision that didn't ask for belief. The timestamp wasn't wrong. It was early enough to be invisible and late enough to be binding. I followed the incident number back through the log, noting the masked suffix that matched the earlier access override, the same generic phrasing that keeps hands clean by keeping language abstract, and I felt the mid-structure spike, not as fear, but as clarity, the kind that turns reaction into two-man plan. I replaced the clipboard on the cart exactly as I found it, the pages aligned, the pen returned because evidence survives best when it doesn't announce itself, and I walked toward the ballroom with my pace unchanged, letting the room read me as reliable. Inside, the space was being reset, chairs nudged into alignment, the glass podium polished until it reflected the ceiling's grid, and I watched how staff moved with renewed purpose, unaware that the sequence they trusted had already been contradicted by their own records. I asked for a confirmation of processing windows and received an answer that referenced policy rather than fact, a distinction that mattered because policy describes intention while fact describes action. The clipboard's weight lingered in my hands even after I let it go, a somatic reminder that systems leave fingerprints on those who read them closely. I stepped aside to make a call from a quiet alcove, not to confront but to verify, asking questions framed as scheduling checks, collecting answers that settled into place like tiles in a mosaic that no one else could yet see. The anomaly held under scrutiny the time of day consistent across references, the language consistent across departments, and I adjusted my strategy accordingly, knowing that premature exposure would invite explanation while delayed exposure would force acknowledgement. The present intruded only as necessary, a vibration from my phone when a meeting reminder appeared that no longer included me, and I dismissed it without comment because reaction would have served the wrong timeline. I returned to the corridor and paused by the bright doorway to the operations office, lights spilling out as before, and felt the constraint not as exclusion but as instruction, a signal to continue gathering rather than speaking. When the log closed under the clip, the sequence locked, and waiting became a form of control. The wristbands arrived in a cardboard box just after lunch, past tense, carrying the weight, because this was when authority stopped being abstract and started brushing skin when a stack of security wristbands lay on the operations table. sorted by color and access tier. I lifted one and felt the tacky resistance of fresh adhesive, the quiet promise that once fastened, it would not be removed without leaving a mark, and I slipped it around my wrist to test the fit, noting how easily permission becomes visible when it's coated in plastic. The ops supervisor stood nearby, with a clipboard tucked to his side, watching the room with the practiced neutrality of someone paid to notice without reacting, and I asked about distribution protocols as if curiosity were my only motive. He answered in policy, language first, then paused, eyes flicking to the corridor, and lowered his voice just enough to change the meaning of what followed, a witness statement delivered as operational housekeeping. He mentioned a late request, routed through him a confirmation given after hours, a decision he had logged because logging protects staff when intent is unclear, and the consequence arrived immediately as my questions narrowed my tone, steadied my posture, shifted from inquiry to intake. He cited a shift window and a generic location, the time of day precise without being dramatic, and I recognized the pattern because systems repeat themselves when they're being careful. The wristband on my arm itched slightly, a physical reminder that access leaves traces, and I thanked him without gratitude the way you do when you need the door to stay open. When he confirmed the instruction came with "do not escalate" language, the room stopped, pretending it was neutral. I moved with him toward the side corridor where noise thins and conversations become records by default, and he pointed out where the request had been noted, the same phrasing I had seen before, the same abstract nouns that make responsibility portable. The witness statement wasn't theatrical. It was procedural, the kind of truth that gains power by refusing to announce itself, and I felt the pressure escalate as I realized how many people had touched the decision without owning it. An HR liaison appeared briefly at the edge of the corridor, badge-clipped, high eyes scanning, and the supervisor straightened the choreography, tightening as authority drifted closer without speaking. The wristband's color marked me as authorized to be there, and I wondered how many conversations rely on color to proceed, how often access determines which truths are safe to say aloud. I asked one more question framed as compliance and received an answer that closed a loop I hadn't named, confirming that the instruction had been repeated, not corrected, and that repetition had made it policy by habit. The immediate consequence was strategic. I stopped seeking corroboration and started mapping exposure, noting who could confirm without risk, who would require cover, and how timing could convert quiet confirmations into undeniable facts. The supervisor returned to his post and resumed checking boxes, the wristbands stacked neatly, the room satisfied that order had been maintained, and I walked back toward the ballroom with my pace measured to match the environment. Inside, technicians tested the wireless mic again, the sound crisp and obedient, and I felt the contrast between amplified authority and whispered truth sharpen my focus. I watched the HR liaison confer with a coordinator, their body language closed, efficient, and I understood that escalation would not come from inside that circle until something forced it, until public proof made silence expensive. I adjusted the wristband, pressing the adhesive firmly, so it would leave a mark if removed, a small decision that felt symbolic without being performative, because evidence doesn't have to be dramatic to be effective. The afternoon progressed with a brittle, calm conversations, shorter smiles, more careful, and I moved through tasks with the confidence of someone who knows the floor plan better than the script. The witness didn't accuse, he confirmed, and confirmation changed the cost of waiting. I stepped into the alcove again and made a note of the shift window he had mentioned, the generic location tag, the phrasing that signaled intent without naming it, and I realized that danger now lived not in speaking, but in speaking at the wrong time. The wristband stayed on as I crossed the threshold into the brighter light, my access visible, my silence deliberate, and I felt the threat sharpen not as fear but as urgency, the understanding that the public stage would soon demand a version of the truth it could not ignore. With the wristband sealed and the statement logged, the countdown started where everyone could pretend not to hear it. The recorder felt warmer than it should have when I picked it up from the tech drawer, past tense, holding steady because this was the moment reversal stopped being theoretical and learned how to speak when a small audio recorder with a red light sat heavy in my palm and turned intent into decis artifact. I checked the label on the back, a generic asset tag, and a short batch code that meant nothing until it meant everything, and I slid my thumb along the edge to feel the switch, the tactile certainty that something had been captured without needing my permission. The alcove off the ballroom hummed softly, HVAC cycling footsteps passing without pause, and I closed the door just enough to signal privacy without creating suspicion, a balance learned through years of managing rooms that prefer not to. No. I pressed play once quietly, and the voice came through clean and unembellished, the cadence familiar, the phrasing precise, a private instruction spoken with the confidence of someone who believes process will absorb consequence. The recording referenced a filing window, a hold until the room was full, a reminder to keep it clean, all framed as logistics, and the safe details anchored it in time and place without naming dates, a duration counter ticking, a generic staters and teverdators, a duration daughters. Location tag embedded in the file header, enough to make denial. Expensive later. The immediate consequence arrived as a physical stillness, my shoulders settling, my breath slowing because contradiction had just become audible, and audibility changes power faster than anger ever could. I listened again, not for shock but for structure, noting the sequence, the pauses, the assumption of compliance, and I recognized how thoroughly the public narrative had been rehearsed without me. The recorder didn't reveal a secret, it inverted the timeline and took control of it. I stopped playback before the end and saved a duplicate, labeling it with neutral language because evidence survives best when it doesn't argue, and I returned the recorder to the drawer exactly as I found it, the red light dark the object, innocently waiting for the next request. The corridor outside felt louder after that, conversations brushing past laughter, resuming its place, and I moved through the space with a new awareness of leverage, the kind that doesn't announce itself but rearranges options in silence. I checked my notes and matched the audio's phrasing to the internal email, to the access log, to the incident timestamp, watching the mosaic lock into a pattern that no single piece could claim alone, and I felt the major reversal not as triumph, but as relief, the relief of coherence after weeks of calibrated confusion. The wireless mic was being tested again in the ballroom, the sound crisp, authoritative, and I watched technicians adjust levels, with the trust that comes from believing the system is honest, believing that what travels through it is meant to be heard. I resisted the urge to confront because confrontation would invite explanation, and explanation would soften edges that needed to stay sharp, and instead, I focused on placement, on when and where sound becomes proof rather than noise. I made a call from the quiet stairwell voice, low framing the conversation around verification and timing, not accusation, and received confirmation that mirrored the recording's assumptions. The same language, the same patience with consequences deferred. The consequence of that call was strategic alignment. I now knew who would need to be present when the audio surfaced, who would recognize its weight without prompting, and how public context could turn a private instruction into a shared reckoning. I returned to the alcove and stood with the door half open, light spilling in as before the doorway, bright and permissive in appearance, while my movement narrowed by design, and I understood that the motif had shifted from waiting to, choosing, from collecting to deploying. A coordinator asked if everything was ready, and I answered yes without elaboration, because readiness no longer meant smooth execution but controlled exposure, and both look identical until the moment they diverge. The program stack sat neatly on a table, font's crisp promises intact, and I imagined how the recording would land against that backdrop, not as an interruption but as a correction, a sound that would force the room to reconcile sequence with intention. When the recorder went back into the drawer, the room lost its alibi and gained a clock. I checked the time of day on my phone and noted how close it sat to the rehearsal window, referenced in the audio, not because coincidence mattered, but because alignment does, and I felt the pressure sharpen into focus rather than fear. The final decision wasn't whether to reveal, but when to do it, so that denial would cost more than acknowledgement, when witnesses would already be present, when authority would have to choose between defending process and honoring fact. I walked back into the ballroom and took my place just outside the brightest light, the familiar position now chosen rather than imposed, and I watched the room prepare to receive a version of itself it hadn't rehearsed. By the time the red light mattered again, the power had already changed hands. The still image waited in my inbox when I returned to the alcove, past tense steady, because this was the moment pressure stopped being theoretical and asked for a decision when a time-stamped CCTV still appeared as a thumbnail no, larger than a postcard and carried more weight than any conversation I could initiate. I opened it without enlarging, first reading the frame the way operations people do, scanning edges before faces, noticing the generic location tag in the corner and the minute marker aligned to the window, referenced everywhere else, and the WinIt. Immediate consequence arrived as a narrowing of options, rather than a surge of feeling. The image showed the side entrance with its neutral signage and clean sightlines. A figure paused, mid-step beneath a ceiling grid that never lies, and the timestamp sat there quietly. A witness that doesn't argue, doesn't apologize, just persists. I enlarged the frame and noted the badge color, the angle of the shoulder, the alignment of the doors, details that matter because they anchor truth to architecture, and I saved it with the same neutral naming convention I'd used before. Because naming is a form of leverage when it's done carefully. The HR policy document arrived minutes later as an attachment forwarded without commentary, a PDF with section headers and subsection letters that read like a map of acceptable behavior until you trace the route that was taken instead. I opened it and searched for the clause I already knew existed, the one about pre-notification and conflict disclosure, the requirement for separation of roles when personal interest intersects with operational control, and the word sat there in calm, precise language that didn't anticipate being tested. The immediate consequence was behavioral again. I stopped considering private resolution and started measuring public timing because policy without witnesses is suggestion, and policy with witnesses becomes instruction. The still image didn't accuse anyone. It fixed the sequence in a way policy could finally enforce. I compared the timestamp on the still to the filing window referenced in the audio, to the incident log, to the access override, and the alignment was clean enough to feel intentional. The kind of precision that systems achieve when people believe no one will look across silos. I printed the policy page that mattered and slid it into a folder, not as a threat but as context, because context turns proof into consequence, and I placed the still image on top so the order told its own story. The glass podium was being wheeled into place in the ballroom, catching light as it moved, and I felt the clock pressure ladder tighten, the understanding that once the room filled, denial would require coordination that could not happen in real time. I made one more call, careful and brief, confirming attendance and authority presence without naming reasons, and the answer I received was neutral enough to be honest, a confirmation that the right people would be there because the program demanded it. The pressure escalated, not as panic, but as focus, the kind that sharpens edges and reduces noise, and I adjusted my plan accordingly, deciding not to escalate early, not to warn, not to invite negotiation that would soften the impact. I stood near the tech table and watched the wireless mic being tested again, the sound crisp and compliant, and I imagined how the still image would read, projected how the policy language would land against the bright clarity of public lighting, how the room would have to reconcile intention with record. The HR liaison passed close enough for me to catch the edge of the policy binder under her arm, and I noted the mirrored preparation without acknowledging it because symmetry matters when outcomes are about to flip. I checked the still image one last time, zooming into the corner where the timestamp sat, the generic location tag unremarkable, and I felt the forced decision settle into place, reveal now and invite explanation, or wait until the stage guarantees witnesses and explanation becomes confession by omission. I chose the latter without ceremony because the choice wasn't emotional, it was procedural, and procedures win when rooms are full. The policy didn't threaten. It offered a clean path that only worked in public. The crowd began to gather, programs rustling, voices rising and falling, and the glass podium took its place under the brightest light, an object designed to make statements feel official by reflection alone. I moved to my position just outside the central aisle, the familiar margin now intentional, and I felt the risk sharpen as the doors closed with soft finality, the sound registering as a boundary rather than a lock. The still image and the policy sat together in my folder, the order unchanged, and I understood that the next minutes would convert preparation into outcome, not because I would speak, but because the room would see, and seeing changes what authority can ignore. The wireless mic hummed briefly and went quiet, the prelude to attention, and I felt the weight of timing settle into my shoulders, the calm that comes when the last variable is crowd density. When the podium stopped moving and the doors stayed shut, waiting became the only advantage left. The ballroom settled into a disciplined hush as the final cues aligned, past tense grounding me, because this was when choreography became consequence, when the glass podium stood centered under the brightest light and made even breathing feel official. Programs rustled once and stopped. The wireless mic rested in its cradle obedient, while the projector warmed a faint whir, signaling readiness rather than spectacle. I took my position at the margin where sightlines converge, the familiar edge, now a deliberate choice, and watched faces calibrate to expectation, to the promise of order that public spaces sell so convincingly. The coordinator nodded to the tech booth. The screen lit cleanly. The room leaned forward as one body, not out of curiosity but habit, because attention follows light when light is framed correctly. The first slide appeared as planned, then cleared. The glass podium caught a reflection of the ceiling grid, straight lines reinforcing the idea of neutrality, and the mic chirped once, as if to test obedience. The projector shifted again, not abruptly, just enough to register a transition, and the legal filing record filled the screen in a format designed to be believed. A clean header, a filing window displayed without calendar specificity, a masked reference string, and a jurisdictional label that reads as authority, even to those who never parse it. The audience didn't gasp. They went quiet in the way rooms do when something procedural interrupts celebration, when the shape of proof arrives before the meaning has time to argue. I felt the immediate consequence in the posture of the front row shoulders squaring phones, lowering the witness wave, beginning its slow, irreversible arc. The filing record advanced one page, then another, each screen change paced to allow reading without inviting commentary, and I watched comprehension spread by adjacency, not announcement, as people glanced sideways to confirm they were seeing what they thought they were seeing. The mic stayed silent. Silence did the work. A caption at the bottom identified the processing window in neutral language, the same time of day range that had appeared everywhere else, and the consistency made denial feel childish rather than strategic. The glass podium reflected the filing record back at the room, and authority switched hands without a word. A low murmur tried to start, and failed, collapsing into the sound of fabric and breath, because the room had been trained to wait for permission before reacting, and permission had not been granted. The projector held the final page long enough for the back rows to read it, then dimmed slightly, not off, just lowered a cue that the truth had landed and did not require amplification. The coordinator looked toward the side entrance as if following a script that had just been rewritten, and the doors opened on a hinge that sounded louder than it should have in the quiet. Security stepped aside with practiced ease, velvet rope, drawn back not to block but to channel, and an HR official entered with a posture that reads as calm to the untrained eye and decisive to everyone else. She did not approach the podium. She did not need to. The authority was already present, embedded in the record now shared. A second official followed, credentials visible but understated, a badge catching the light once and then settling, and the crowd adjusted its internal math, recalculating what counted as rumor and what now counted as process. The mic remained untouched. No announcement competed with the record. I noticed how the filing window on the screen aligned with the time of day stamped on the earlier camera feed, how the masked reference echoed the one in the incident log, how the room recognized pattern before it recognized culpability. People shifted in their seats, some reaching for phones and stopping themselves, aware that recording now would be redundant because the proof had already chosen its medium. The HR official spoke briefly, not into the mic but to the coordinator, a sentence that sounded like procedure rather than verdict, and the coordinator nodded, relief and tension crossing her face in equal measure. The projector brightened again, displaying a neutral holding slide, while the officials took positions near the aisle, close enough to be seen, far enough to avoid spectacle. The glass podium stood between them and the audience like a boundary that had finally decided what it was for. I felt the second immediate consequence arrive as a loosening in my shoulders, not triumph, but confirmation, the calm that follows when timing proves correct. A ripple moved through the crowd as recognition caught up with implication, the witness wave completing itself, a few whispers, a longer silence, then a collective stillness that reads as acceptance. No one laughed, no one clapped. The room had learned the rules of this moment too quickly to test them. The officials exchanged a glance and moved not toward me but toward the side corridor, their path clear without instruction, and I understood that authority entry had occurred exactly when it was allowed to, not a second earlier, not a breath later. Once the filing record became public, the door opened and closed in the same motion. The velvet rope was repositioned, a small adjustment that altered flow without drawing attention, and security resumed its stance as if nothing unusual had happened, because normalization is how institutions metabolize disruption. I remained where I was, the margin intact, watching as the coordinator resumed control of the room with minimal language, directing attention away from the screen and toward the next neutral action, a pause that would be remembered as professionalism rather than interruption. The mic was lifted and tested, a soft tap, producing a polite thud, and then set back down unused because the room no longer needed sound to understand what had changed. Faces turned forward again, but the posture was different now. The weight redistributed, the sense of inevitability replaced by accounting. I caught the reflection of the filing record one last time in the glass podium as the projector dimmed fully the image, ghosting for a second before disappearing, and I felt the final consequence settle into place. What had been planned in private had been proven in public, and public proof changes what authority can protect. The officials remained visible, their presence ordinary and unmistakable, and the room adjusted around them the way rooms do when control has shifted and the new arrangement must be learned. As the lights softened and the program moved on, I stepped back one pace, then another, not retreating but making space, and I understood that the payoff had arrived not as a speech or a confrontation, but as a clean alignment of record and witness. When the projector went dark and the doors stayed open, the truth no longer needed my voice to move. The velvet rope barrier sat where it always had, past tense steady, because this was when consequence learned how to look ordinary, when justice arrived without ceremony and wore the uniform of procedure instead of anger. The room had reset itself into workable order after the interruption. Lights softened, programs stacked again, voices returning at a lower volume that suggested respect rather than relief. I stood near the aisle and watched how people recalibrated distance from the podium, from the officials, from one another, the choreography of compliance resuming with a different center of gravity. The HR official moved with quiet purpose, conferring with security near the side corridor, her gestures minimal, her language clipped and precise, and I noticed how quickly the crowd learned not to stare, how attention slid away from spectacle toward process, because process promises resolution without requiring judgment. The velvet rope shifted a few inches, a small adjustment that redirected foot traffic away from the corridor, and the effect was immediate, a clean channel created where chaos might have gathered, the barrier doing its work without announcing itself. I was asked to step aside by a coordinator whose tone was neutral enough to be kind, and I complied without hesitation because cooperation now served clarity rather than concealment. We stood near the tech table where the projector had cooled the glass podium, reflecting softer light, and she spoke in the language of next steps of documentation and follow-up of timing that would be handled by others. I listened and nodded, not because I needed instruction, but because acknowledgement keeps processes moving, and movement mattered more than words now. The HR official approached with a folder held flat against her palm, not extended, a posture that communicates authority without invitation, and she confirmed logistics that required no response, her eyes steady, her voice even. There was no accusation, no apology, just a recalibration of roles that settled like a verdict because it was framed as routine. The immediate consequence arrived as access restored without fanfare. A badge scan cleared a door, opened a coordinator, deferred to my assessment of a logistical detail, as if it had always been so, and the shift felt less like victory than alignment, the system correcting itself after resisting long enough to test credibility. I watched how quickly people adapted to the new arrangement, how questions redirected toward me again, how the language of collaboration returned without preamble, and I understood that institutions prefer certainty to loyalty, prefer records to relationships because records are easier to defend. The velvet rope remained in place not as a punishment but as a boundary, and I felt the relief of boundaries finally serving truth instead of hiding it. A brief announcement was made, not about the filing, not about the disruption, but about a scheduling adjustment that would ensure everyone's comfort, the kind of language that covers consequences without naming causes. The room accepted it gratefully, grateful to be told what to do next, and the program resumed with a revised sequence that made room for reality without advertising it. I noticed faces soften, shoulders drop, the collective nervous system settling as uncertainty gave way to direction, and I realized how much harm ambiguity had been doing under the guise of politeness. The payoff didn't arrive as punishment, it arrived as order reasserting itself around the truth. The officials remained visible for a time, then moved discreetly to the periphery, their presence no longer necessary because the record had done its work, and the velvet rope stayed put, a reminder that flow is a choice enforced by design. I stepped behind the barrier once, then back out, testing the permission that now existed without needing to be requested, and the act felt strangely anticlimactic, because justice, when it's procedural, doesn't thrill, it stabilizes. The coordinator asked for my input on a revised timeline, and I gave it plainly without qualifiers, the way I used to, before caution crept into my voice and the words landed cleanly accepted without negotiation. I felt the weight of the past weeks lift not as emotion, but as space, mental room returning where vigilance had lived, and I took a slow breath because the body registers safety after the system does. There was no confrontation with him, no hallway scene, no exchange that could be misquoted later, and I understood that this absence was itself a result, a containment that prevented further harm by refusing to stage it. The record had spoken. Authority had entered. The velvet rope had redirected traffic. What remained was implementation, the unglamorous work of making consequences durable. I gathered my materials from the tech table, stacking papers with deliberate care, and noticed how my hands no longer shook, how the small rituals that calmed me were no longer defensive, but simply habitual again. As the event concluded and people began to stand, the witness wave reversed itself, moving from stillness to murmured conversation to purposeful exits, and the barrier guided them smoothly, preventing bottlenecks, preserving dignity. I watched from the side as gratitude and confusion mixed in equal measure, as people processed a story they would tell later without details, and I felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the truth had been shared without becoming gossip. When the velvet rope held and the room flowed around it, accountability stopped being negotiable and became structural. The room is quieter now, present tense, insisting because this is where the story returns to itself, where aftermath feels less like an ending and more like a stabilized system learning its new balance. I stand near the side corridor as staff begin the practiced work of breakdown cables, coiled chairs, stacked lights dimmed in stages that signal completion without ceremony. The USB drive sits inside a clear evidence bag on the tech table, tagged and sealed ordinary in appearance, definitive in effect, and I notice how objects that end things rarely look dramatic when they're finally doing their job. The glass podium reflects a softer grid, now lines less severe, as if the room has relaxed its jaw, and the wireless mic rests where it always does when it no longer needs to command anything. I feel the shift in my body before I name it a widening, where vigilance had lived a return of peripheral awareness that tells me safety has moved from conditional to structural. I walk the perimeter once, not to check but to inhabit my steps, unhurried the present, allowing detail without threat. The velvet rope remains in place near the side entrance, a boundary that did its work and will be remembered by staff more than guests, a lesson in flow rather than punishment. Security nods as I pass the nod, easy, unremarkable, and that ease matters because it means the system has accepted the correction and moved on. The USB drive catches my eye again, the evidence bag crinkling softly when a coordinator adjusts its position, and I recognize how quiet accountability can be when it's embedded properly, how it doesn't require performance to persist. I sign a short form acknowledging receipt and transfer my name printed clearly, the date omitted by design, and the act feels like punctuation rather than emphasis. I step back into the ballroom and take in the empty rows, the absence of bodies, revealing the architecture that had been hidden by expectation. Earlier, the sightline's clean, the exit's obvious, the space honest. Now that it isn't staging anything. A few staff members share muted jokes as they work the release of tension, sounding like normalcy returning, and I smile without thinking, the reflex intact again. The coordinator thanks me for staying late, and I reply that it's fine because it is, because staying no longer feels like guarding a breach but like closing a loop. The USB drive remains sealed, untouched by drama, and I'm struck by how much damage had been done by anticipation rather than action, by plans made in rooms that preferred not to be seen. I step into the alcove where so many quiet decisions had accumulated, the door half open as always, light spilling in, and I let myself stand there without counting seconds, without tracking who might pass. The motif resolves not with a flourish but with a feeling. The door opened fully and the light belonged to me. The sentence lands in my chest like a verdict that doesn't need appeal because it names ownership rather than permission, agency rather than access. I breathe and the breath stays easy, not caught on the idea of what might happen next, because what happens next will follow process now, not improvisation. I check my phone and see a brief message confirming a follow-up meeting, scheduled through proper channels, a neutral subject line, a time window that respects notice, and I feel gratitude not for the meeting itself, but for the fact that respect has returned to the mechanics of communication. I respond with a simple acknowledgement and put the phone away, the gesture unburdened by calculation. The evidence bag is collected by an official who handles it with professional care, the USB drive disappearing into a case that will carry it where it needs to go, and I watch without attachment because the work it will do no longer requires my presence. The room absorbs the removal without comment, the way systems do when outcomes are expected. As staff finish, I help fold a final table, the metal legs locking into place with a familiar snap, and the physicality grounds me, reminds me that resolution often looks like tidying, like restoring surfaces to neutral. The coordinator offers to walk me out, and I accept, not because I need accompaniment, but because shared exits mark shared closure, and we move toward the doors together. The hallway beyond is brighter than it was earlier, or perhaps it only feels that way because nothing is blocking my sightline now, and the exit opens smoothly when pushed, no resistance, no hesitation. Outside, the air is cooler, the soundscape wider, and I pause on the threshold to feel the difference between inside and out, between managed light and open night. I think briefly of the career I left and the skills I carried forward without credit, and I don't frame it as loss anymore because those skills were never gone, only rerouted, waiting for a context that would honor them. I think of how easily silence can be mistaken for consent, how quickly consent can be drafted in someone else's language, and how records correct that distortion when given the chance. The USB drive is already moving through channels that don't care about narrative-only sequence, and that indifference feels like justice, not coldness, but fairness stripped of favoritism. I walk to my car without hurry, the lot lights steady the night, uncomplicated, and I feel the absence of the old tension as a presence of calm. I know there will be paperwork conversations, framed carefully outcomes that take time to settle into memory, but none of that presses on me now because the essential work is complete. The public truth has aligned with the private record, and the system has responded. The future feels procedural in the best way, predictable enough to plan without fear, flexible enough to adapt without surrender. I open the car door and sit for a moment before starting the engine, letting the stillness register, letting my body learn that it doesn't need to scan for exits anymore. The door stays open, the light steady, and my life moves forward on record.